Often an outside eye into a country's politics can deliver unique insights. Let's speak now to another South African living and working in Baltimore in the USA. Kurt Orderson is an award-winning filmmaker and visual artist. Kurt, thank you very much for your time. It's great to chat to you. Now, I know that you're not voting, you can't vote, but you're living in the USA. As a South African who's come from a country that has such a racially divided past, seeing the sorts of things that we've seen playing out on the streets of the USA, with a president who says he's the least racist president ever. What is it like in the USA, particularly on polling day?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the platform. So obviously right now, I mean, the mood right now here in Baltimore specifically is fairly quiet. A lot of people obviously made their vote via mail. So mail-in voting has been, I guess, obviously the process of how a lot of Americans have placed their vote. And so even though obviously the Republicans have contested the mail-in voting process, saying, things like it's illegal and all kinds of, other irrelevant ideas around what the kind of illegal processes around these democratic electoral processes are. But the mood is very quiet. I've spoken to a lot of my people this morning just to check in. Obviously a lot of them have voted, did they vote via mail? And so I know that people are standing in queues across the country right now. But yeah, that's the kind of scene right now here in Baltimore.
So, Kurt, just a little bit more about you. Your work, I understand, often draws comparisons between South Africa, you hail from Mitchell's Plain, and the USA. And you put together a film, Not in My Neighborhood, which focused on apartheid spatial planning, which is something we're still grappling with here in South Africa, and current-day gentrification. And you compared Cape Town and Joburg with New York. So you're poignantly and deeply aware of racial divisions, which often become geographical divisions. Do you see the USA as an increasingly racially polarized country under Trump? Or does the average American actually just want to get along with everyone, no matter their color? Or is it becoming a more polarized nation?
Yeah, I think on your last point, I think from my observation, being in this country kind of back and forth between here and South Africa for the last 14 years, I think this political moment right now has been probably the most polarized in terms of, what the kind of idea around what the unification process means for the U.S. And I think this country is also grappling a lot right now. I think the confrontation with its past, it's whether it's colonial past, whether it's about dispossession, civil rights, slavery, etc. So all these things are coming to the fore right now. And I think, in the context of my work, I think I place my work within the context of, looking at kind of transnational solidarity, looking at, issues around globalization, what does democracy mean, and also, looking at these kind of colonial legacies and looking at the colonial histories and similarities of how people experience oppression. So I think in the context of South Africa, obviously, we've had various forms of institutionalized racism and structural apartheid, etc., which kind of we're still grappling with, as you mentioned. And so what I see here, for example, I think there's the cry right now for, I guess, a Nelson Mandela moment, a person who can unify this nation. And yes, they had an Obama moment, right? And I think that's a kind of very much a nostalgic, euphoric moment that practically speaking, in terms of the economic inequalities, racial divides, issues around employment, those are still issues that this country is confronting. And I think it's probably the most divided in its entire history, this political moment. And I think that Donald Trump and the Republican Party is at guilt, with, polarizing the political discourse in this country.
The Black Lives Matter protest that we saw really come to a head earlier this year, and you say we almost need a Mandela moment. But as a black South African, did you experience those protests differently in the USA to perhaps an African American would have?
Yeah. So I've been, as I said, my relationship with the US has been over spans of over the last 14 years, and And ironically, I was actually in the country the last election, 2016, and I was actually shooting my documentary, as you mentioned, Not in My Neighborhood, which is obviously looking at this kind of comparison study with the history of apartheid spatial planning, colonization between Sao Paulo, Cape Town, and New York. And, I was at the polling station. One of our characters actually in the film, he was voting for the first time. And so we were, running the streets in Brooklyn, the voting station, and he was doing voting campaigning in Long Island, and I was actually following this whole process. And I think what, looking at that comparison, that moment, and the crux of America really confronting, looking at the mirror, to say this is really the legacy, of oppression that still continues itself and hasn't really articulated a way of how to deal with these racial disparities and inequality. So for me, when I experienced the Black Lives Matter moment, obviously my reference is South Africa, right? And so I look at kind of the civic movements and the mobilization, whether it is, during the moment of the UDF, and the civic protests around basic needs and housing, water, electricity in South Africa. That's the cry right now in the US. But because I think civic engagement, yes, it's strong, but because the system itself and the legal system is so oppressive that, you could see a lot of the, Black Lives Matter protesters being arrested, the army being called in. So you're dealing with a police state, right?
Yeah.
The military industrial complex is very real in this country, right? And so when I experienced this moment, I'm in solidarity first and foremost with Black Americans, right? Because, there's a reflection, right?
Sure.
There's a similarity in the history and the legacy.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to ask our producers to make sure we check in with you when the results start coming in. We know that it's everyone is saying that Biden has the edge, but of course, we've heard that 4 years ago, so I think we've also got to be very careful. Thank you so much, Kurt Orderson. He, of course, is a South African filmmaker, and he's living in Baltimore in the USA.